The room held maybe 40 people that October morning in 2012, and most of them had driven in from ground that had cracked open like old leather through the driest summer anyone under 60 could remember. Outside, the courthouse maple had dropped half its leaves 6 weeks early, and the sky above the extension building had gone the color of old brass, flat and waterless. Inside, the folding chairs were arranged in 8 uneven rows, and the smell of the room was burnt coffee and damp wool and the quiet exhaustion of men who had spent 4 months watching their fields go to dust. They sat with their arms crossed and their coffee cups going cold, and nobody was in a mood for numbers that were going to confirm what they already knew. The county average for corn that year was 54 bushels per acre. A man named Roy Lawson, farming 180 ridge acres 12 miles northwest of town, had come in at 91. The extension agent reading the numbers paused when he got to Roy's line. He read it once to himself, then read it aloud the way you read a line you are not entirely sure you believe. 91 bushels on hill ground in a drought year. A few of the men in the back rows turned to look at each other. One of them, 3 rows back from Roy, was a man named Dale Cottrell, who had been the county extension agent for most of 20 years before retiring the previous spring. Dale sat very still. His coffee cup stayed on his knee and did not move. Roy did not look back at him. He had not come to the meeting to look at anyone in particular. He had come because Vera told him he ought to, because the numbers were worth putting in the room, and because his father had believed that you owed the land the dignity of a documented witness when it proved something true. Let me tell you how that number got there, and what it cost Roy Lawson to earn it, and why it took 33 years for the right people to finally sit still and listen. In the spring of 1979, Roy inherited 180 acres from his father, Harold Lawson, who had farmed the same ridge and hill ground since 1952, and who had died in February of a heart attack at 61, still owing less on his place than most of his neighbors owed on their trucks. Harold had left Roy the land, a 1963 tractor that ran on stubbornness and fresh plugs, and a composition notebook full of soil observations going back to 1956. The notebook was held together with a rubber band, and Harold had written on the cover, in his block print handwriting, "What the ground holds is what you put in it." Roy was 24 years old. He had 1 year of community college behind him, and 12 years of working alongside his father, and he understood the land the way a man understands something he has been trained in since he was old enough to be handed a tool. The 180 acres were not the kind of ground a man brags about at the co-op. The parcels ran up and over 2 distinct ridges, and the slopes ranged from gentle to honest, and there was a creek-bottom corner of about 20 acres that could be planted if the spring was dry, which it often was not. The rest was working hill ground, and in 1979, working hill ground in that county was considered a kind of inheritance that a man accepted politely and then figured out how to supplement. It did not tile drain easily. It did not plant as fast as the flat fields down toward the river. It yielded somewhere between 80 and 100 bushels of corn in a good year, and it looked like hard work set against the bottom land that was going for $1,200 an acre and rising. Roy knew it was not fashionable ground. He did not need anyone to tell him that. He moved into the farmhouse he had grown up in, took the rubber band off his father's notebook, and read every entry Harold had ever made. The entries were written in pencil, some of the older pages gone soft at the edges, where Harold's thumb had turned them season after season, and the dates ran from April 1956 through November 1978. What he found there was not a complaint. Harold had been tracking organic matter by feel and by the color of his turned soil for 23 years, and the notes recorded something that Roy understood immediately. The ridges held what the bottoms shed. When a wet spring waterlogged the creek-bottom fields, the ridges drained. When a dry July hit, the ridges had something to give that the river-bottom clays, with their organic content worn down by decade after decade of row cropping and bare winter soil, simply did not have left. 2 years after Roy moved in, Dale Cottrell drove out to take a look. Dale was 38 then, and he had the confidence of a man who had done this job long enough to know the answer before he knocked on the door. He was not unkind. He wore a pressed shirt and clean trousers, and he shook Roy's hand with both of his own, the way a man does when he is about to deliver news he considers a favor. They sat at the kitchen table, and Vera had set out coffee without being asked and gone back to work at the counter, and the morning light came through the east window and fell across the oilcloth in a long, pale stripe. Dale set his clipboard on the chair beside him. "Roy," he said, sitting at the kitchen table, with a cup of Vera's coffee going warm in his hands, "I want to be honest with you about this ground. A man your age, starting from scratch, you'd be better off leasing some of the Harmon bottom acres over on Route 9, and maybe cash renting your hills out to somebody with older equipment they don't mind putting on a slope." Roy turned his coffee cup once on the table. "What would I do with the money from the cash rent?" "Capitalize," Dale said. "The future in this county is down on the flat. Tile drainage is going to change what those bottoms can do in a wet year, and the yields per acre are going to outpace anything you can grow on a ridge. You're working twice as hard for 2/3 the bushels." Roy nodded as if he was taking it seriously, because he was. He had been taught to take serious men seriously, to give their arguments their full weight before he put them down. He thought about his father's notebook. He thought about the 1966 drought year Harold had documented, when the ridge corn had come in at 82 bushels and the creek bottom corn, 2 miles away, had come in at 31, because the organic matter in those fields was already gone, and there was nothing left in the soil to hold the water that wasn't there. "I appreciate you coming out," Roy said. Dale drove away in a clean pickup with the county seal on the door, and Roy walked back out to the field he had been no-tilling since March, and thought about what he was going to plant for a cover crop that fall. He was going to try a mix of cereal rye and hairy vetch. His father had used rye alone. Roy thought the vetch might help with nitrogen and with root mass, and more root mass meant more organic matter decomposing into the soil each spring, and more organic matter meant more water-holding capacity, and more water-holding capacity meant that when the year came that it didn't rain enough, his ground would have something to give. That was Roy's answer to Dale Cottrell. He just didn't say it out loud. Scout came into Roy's life in 1982, a blue heeler pup that Vera's brother had dropped off in a cardboard box on the porch steps, and from the day Roy brought him out to the field for the first time, Scout seemed to understand that his job was to stay close and not get underfoot. He was a working dog in the specific sense that he worked by being present, and over the years he became as much a part of the farm's daily rhythm as the planting calendar. He ran the fence lines with Roy in the morning, moving at a low trot through the timothy that came up thick along the ridge edge every June, his nose working the damp grass ahead of Roy's boots. He slept in the truck when Roy went to town. He was particular about where he lay down, and he always chose the highest ground available, a habit Roy found sensible. The year after Dale's visit, Roy began paying off the balance his father had left on the land. Harold had owed $19,000 against the farm, when he died. A 5-year installment note at 9% that ran through 1984. Roy had kept his input costs low, sold his corn through the elevator at whatever the market gave him, and by the end of 1984 he had made the last payment. He was 29 years old, and he owned 180 acres of hill ground free and clear. There was no celebration. Vera made a pie and they ate it at the kitchen table, with the spiral notebook open to the page where she had written the final payment amount, $4,312 paid in full. She circled it in red ink and put the notebook back in the kitchen drawer. Down the road, Glenn Morrow had made a different kind of decision. Glenn was 30 years old in 1983, a flat-ground man who had grown up working his family's river-bottom acres and who believed, with the specific conviction of someone who had been told so by everyone he respected, that the bottom land was the future of farming in that county. He drove a newer truck than most men his age, and at the co-op counter, where men leaned on the glass and talked numbers, he was the kind of farmer other men cited as a benchmark. He was friendly about it. He was not the kind of man who needed you to agree with him. And he genuinely liked Roy in the way that men like who are doing different things with their lives and have no particular reason to compete. In the fall of 1983, Glenn bought 240 acres of bottomland from the Harmon estate, which was the very ground Dale Cottrell had recommended Roy consider leasing. He paid $240,000 for it, and he financed all but $30,000 on a variable rate agricultural note at 14.5%, with the understanding that rates would come down and the land's productivity would cover the difference. Rates did come down. Not as fast as anyone had hoped, and not before Glenn had spent 2 years making payments that were larger than he had planned for. But by 1986, the note had reset to something more manageable, and by the late 1980s, Glenn was farming his bottom ground and clearing enough margin to keep the land and his equipment notes current. He was not getting rich, but he was building something visible, and visible was what the county measured. Roy was building something else. If you drove past Roy's place in the late 1980s and through the 1990s, what you saw was a man farming modest ground with modest equipment, planting cover crops on ridges that other people had stopped bothering to plant at all, running no-till on slopes that would have swallowed a chisel plow with any real ambition, and producing corn yields that the co-op elevator treated as fine but unremarkable. Nobody was watching Roy Lawson's soil organic matter climb because soil organic matter is invisible from the road. The farm looked like what it was, a hill operation run by a man who did not spend money on inputs he did not need and did not borrow money for equipment that was not worn out. The 1963 tractor finally gave up in 1991, and Roy replaced it with a 1978 model he bought at a neighbor's retirement auction for $4,000 in cash. It did everything he needed it to do. The co-op counter in town was not a place Roy visited for conversation, but Vera went in for seed and supplies often enough to hear what was being said. In the summer of 1995, she came home and told Roy that Denny Hargrove over at the co-op had started calling their place the Ridge Museum, on account of Roy not having traded up to a planter that could handle more than 4 rows and not having bought a single bag of anhydrous ammonia in 15 years. Roy listened to that, finished eating, and went out to check the cover crop stand he had seeded the week before. It was coming in thick and even and green against the brown of the harvested corn rows, the rye already an inch tall in the furrows where the soil was darkest, and it would spend the winter putting root mass into his soil, and come spring he would terminate it, and it would begin breaking down into organic matter that was going to be there in July when the soil needed something to hold against the heat. By the mid-1990s, Roy's soil organic matter had climbed to somewhere between 3 and 3.5%, which he knew from a private soil test he had paid for himself. The county average on the river bottoms was sitting at about 2% and dropping. He did not tell anyone the number because no one had asked and because the number did not mean anything visible yet. It was savings in a form that the county's agricultural economy had no instrument for measuring. In 1999, Dale Cottrell was still the extension agent, and the county fair was where he ran into Roy every August. The fair grandstand sat at the west end of the fairgrounds, and the extension office kept a booth near the cattle barn where Dale would hold court with whoever came by. The booth had a folding table and a row of pamphlets on drainage incentives and soil amendments held flat at the corners by smooth river rocks, and the cattle barn stood close enough that you could hear the livestock shifting in the pens and catch the layered smell of sawdust and manure mixing with the fried dough smoke that drifted west off the midway. That particular August, Roy had stopped by the booth with Scout on a rope and a half-finished ear of roasted corn because Vera had sent him to pick up a seed catalog. Dale looked at Scout, and then at Roy, and then at his own clipboard, and he said it with the practiced ease of a man who considers himself helpful. "Roy, I looked at your elevator tickets from last year. You came in at 88 bushels on your ridge ground. I've got Glenn Morrow pulling 112 on his south bottom quarter. I'm not trying to step on your toes, but that spread tells a story." Roy bit into his corn. "It tells a story," he agreed. "A man your age," Dale said. And he gave Roy the look that a county extension agent gives a man he has been trying to help for going on 2 decades, ought to be thinking about what this ground is really worth, and whether it's worth what you're putting into it. 40 years from now, somebody's going to plow those ridges flat and drain them and get 130 bushels, and you'll have spent 40 years being stubborn about it. Roy scratched Scout behind the ears. "Could be," he said. Then he took the seed catalog and went to find Vera. That was the 3rd time Dale had said something like that to Roy in a setting where other people could hear. The first had been at the kitchen table in 1981. The second had been at a soil health workshop in 1988 where Dale had used Roy's farm as a case study in under-optimized hill ground by name in front of 20 other farmers. This was the 3rd at the fair in 1999 with Scout sitting there and 3 other men standing close enough to hear the bushel comparison. Roy understood that Dale was not being cruel. Dale was being a county extension agent who was confident in his data and had been consistently confirmed by it for 20 years. The problem was that Dale's data measured what was visible, and Roy's advantage was not visible yet. The year it became visible was still 13 years away. Glenn, meanwhile, was building something that looked from the road like real success. In 2002, Glenn added tile drainage to his original 240 acres. The system cost him $48,000, and he financed it at 6.5% over 10 years. The tile worked exactly as promised. Wet springs that had once cost him 2 weeks of planting time disappeared from his calendar, and his yields on the south quarter went from 112 to 122 bushels in the first season with the tile in. He called Roy from his truck the day he got his elevator tickets and told him the number with genuine good nature, the way a man shares news he is proud of without needing to wound anyone with it. 122, Glenn said. "On a year like this one." "That's good corn," Roy said. It was good corn. Roy meant it. He held his own at 89 that year and was satisfied, because his input costs were a fraction of Glenn's, and his land carried no debt. The math was different from Glenn's math, but the 2 men were not comparing the same equation. By 2005, Glenn had expanded his operation to 360 acres, leasing an additional 120 acres of river-bottom ground from a neighbor who had gone into the implement business. His new John Deere planter was paid on a 5-year note. His combine was refinanced. His tile loan was current. He was farming more ground than any man in his township, and Dale Cottrell cited him at the 2006 Winter Extension meeting as an example of forward-thinking management. Roy sat in the back of that meeting and said nothing. In 2008, Glenn bought another 120 acres of bottomland from an estate that was settling fast. He financed the purchase at a variable rate, rolling it into the rest of his borrowing. He was now at 480 acres, all of it flat, most of it borrowed, all of it productive, and the commodity price spike of 2007 and 2008 had made the math look generous. Corn was touching $5 and then $6 a bushel. Land that had been worth $2,200 an acre was climbing toward $4,000. At those prices, Glenn's notes were almost running the farm themselves. Dale told anyone who would listen that this was what responsible expansion looked like. Roy had not expanded. He had farmed his 180 acres the same way he had farmed them since 1979, adding cover crop species and adjusting his rotation, but not borrowing money and not buying ground he could not pay for in full. In 2007, he had the cash to buy a parcel of 30 acres that came up for sale 2 miles away, but the parcel was bottomland and Roy did not want it. Vera asked him why not, and he told her the soil test would come back wrong and she trusted him enough not to push on it. He had his own private number by then. A soil test in 2006 had put his organic matter at 4.2%. He had been building it at roughly 0.1% per year, compounding through every cover crop season and every year of minimal tillage. His ridge soil was holding water at a rate that his father's notebook had hinted at, but never quantified. Roy had a simple way of thinking about it. Every percent of organic matter in a soil could hold roughly 20,000 gallons of water per acre. His soil was holding approximately twice what the county average bottomland was holding, and it had been building that capacity quietly for 27 years. The summer of 2012 arrived the way a structural antagonist always does, without particular announcement, as a condition that had been building in the atmosphere for months before anyone named it. By June, it was dry. By July, it was beyond dry in a way that the county had not experienced since the mid-1980s. The corn crop on the river bottoms began to show stress in the 3rd week of July. The wide leaves curling inward along their midribs to reduce transpiration, the lower leaves yellowing first. The field roads between the bottomland parcels had baked to a hardness that cracked along the wheel tracks, and the air above the low ground shimmered at midday with the particular flatness of a field, giving up its last moisture to the sky for good. Glenn's 480 acres were all on flat, low-organic bottomland, and the flat, low-organic bottomland had nothing left to give once the soil moisture was gone. Roy's ridges were doing something different. It was not dramatic to look at. The ridge corn was under stress too, and Roy did not pretend otherwise. His soil organic matter was at 4.6% by 2012, and that soil was holding water that the bottoms had already surrendered to evaporation 3 weeks earlier. The corn on his ridges was pulling moisture from a reservoir that had been built grain by grain across 33 years of cover crops and undisturbed soil structure, and it was doing it slowly enough to carry the crop through the worst of August without total failure. Scout walked the rows with Roy in the mornings, staying a step or two behind, his nails ticking against the dry clods between the rows, and Roy would stop every few rows and push a soil probe down 12 inches and pull it back out and feel the moisture on the tip. There was still something there. Not much, but something. And in a drought year, something was everything. He pressed his thumb against the cool steel tip and held it a moment, the way his father had held soil in his palm to read its color. And he thought about the 1966 entry in Harold's notebook about ridge corn at 82 when the creek bottom corn 2 miles away had given 31. The arithmetic was the same arithmetic. He had known the year was coming without knowing when it would arrive. By September, when the combine finally ran, Roy came in at 91 bushels per acre. The county average was 54. Glen Morrow's 480 acres averaged 38 bushels. His notes did not care about the drought. The bank that held Glen's variable rate note on the 2008 purchase was not cruel about it, but it was thorough. In the fall of 2012, the note reset to a rate that had climbed with the index, and Glen's debt service on 480 acres of underperforming ground was no longer something he could carry on a 38-bushel corn year. He spent the winter trying to restructure. Roy knew this because Glen told him so himself, sitting at Roy's kitchen table in January of 2013 with his hat in his hands, not asking for help but needing to say it to someone who would hear it without judgment. The kitchen was cold that morning near the window glass, and the radiator under the sill ticked steadily, and Vera had set 2 cups on the table without being asked and then gone to work at the far counter without making a production of her leaving. "I'm going to have to let the East Quarter go," Glen said. He meant the 120 acres he had bought in 2008. "Auction's in March." Scout was on the floor at Roy's feet, and he did not move. "I'm sorry to hear that," Roy said, and he meant it. "What are they asking?" "Whatever it brings," Glen said. "They want the arrears covered and the note current. However much that takes." He turned his hat slowly in his hands. The felt brim darkened at the crease from years of that same motion. Roy watched him do it and did not look away or offer anything that would make the moment easier than it was. The March auction was a cold day, the sky the color of old concrete, and the air still enough that you could hear the auctioneer's voice carry across the bare field from 50 yards off. The East Quarter was stripped of everything but gray corn stubble that the snow had lain on for 2 months and then released, and the soil between the rows had the closed, sealed look of ground that had spent the winter locked against itself. The East Quarter sold for $312,000 to a farm management company out of the state capital. It was $2,600 an acre, less than Glen had paid for it 4 years earlier, when corn was at $6 and the note had seemed to run itself. The auction drew maybe 30 people, which was the kind of crowd a foreclosure-adjacent sale drew in a county that had recently learned humility. Dale was there, standing near the back of the small crowd, in his good coat with his hands in his coat pockets, and he watched the auctioneer's hand drop above the cluster of bidders. He watched the gavel come down without saying anything. Roy stood 20 feet away. He had not come to see Glen lose. He had come because Glen had asked him to come, and Roy had said yes because that was the kind of thing you did for a neighbor who needed a familiar face on a hard day. When it was over, Glen shook Roy's hand and did not try to say much. There was not much to say. The land was gone, and the arithmetic had done what arithmetic does when you give it enough time and the right conditions. The following October was when the extension office meeting happened. The one described at the start of the story. The new extension agent, a young woman named Karen Stroud, who had taken Dale's position after he retired, had compiled the county yield data with a care that Dale had not always applied, and she had included the organic matter context alongside each farm's yield number. When she read Roy's line, she read the full entry. 180 acres, hill ground, no tile, cover cropped continuously since 1979, organic matter documented at 4.6%, yield 91 bushels per acre in the drought year. She said it plainly, the way a person reads a line they find genuinely interesting, and then she moved to the next farm on the list. The room did the math on its own. 54 was the county average. 91 was Roy's number. The difference was 37 bushels per acre, and at the corn price that fall, 37 bushels was worth approximately $67 on 180 acres. That was just over $12,000 in gross yield advantage in a single drought year against the county's best-managed flat ground. And Roy had no debt against which to set that number. After the meeting, Dale walked up to Roy in the parking lot. He did not do it with ceremony. He just walked up and waited for Roy to finish talking to a seed dealer from the next county over. And when the dealer left, Dale put his hand out. "I owe you an honest conversation," Dale said. "I've been owing you one since about 1981. Roy shook his hand. "Come out to the place sometime," he said. "Vera will make coffee." Dale came out 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning when the cover crop had been in the ground for 2 weeks, and the ridges were showing the first thin green of rye coming through the brown. He came in his own truck, not the county vehicle, and he sat at the kitchen table where he had sat in 1981, and Vera set a cup in front of him without ceremony. And then she opened the kitchen drawer and put Harold's composition notebook on the table between them, not as a rebuke, but as an explanation. The notebook settled on the oilcloth with a soft thump, and Dale looked at it for a moment before he reached for it. Dale turned the pages slowly. His coffee sat going from hot to warm while he read. He read Harold's 1966 entry, the one about the drought year yields, the ridge corn at 82 and the creek bottom at 31. He read the entries from the early 1970s where Harold had started tracking soil color as a proxy for organic matter, calling his ridge soil 2 shades darker than the Harmon bottom by July, which was not scientific, but was not wrong. Dale read it the way a man reads something that answers a question he has been asking incorrectly for a long time. "Your father knew this," Dale said. "Yes," Roy said. "You were farming his answer." Roy looked at his coffee cup. "I was farming his ground," he said. "The answer came with it." Scout was on the floor beside Roy's chair, and he lifted his head once when Dale shifted in his seat, then put it back down. The state agronomist came out in the spring of 2015 to do formal soil documentation. By then, Roy's organic matter had climbed to 4.8%, against a county flat ground average of 1.9%. The agronomist, a careful man named Hendricks from the State University Extension Service, walked Roy's ridges with a clipboard and a soil probe, and spent the better part of a morning taking cores at 12 locations across the 180 acres. He moved from the south fence to the north ridge without hurry, pressing the probe to its full depth at each station, drawing it back, noting the color and texture of the core in a column on his clipboard before moving to the next mark. He told Roy the results 2 weeks later by phone. 4.8% average organic matter across the full farm, with the highest reading at 5.1% on the North Ridge where Roy had been applying composted crop residue along the headland since 1988. Hendricks wrote the farm up for the state's annual soil health report as a case study in long-term cover cropping and minimal tillage management on hill ground. Roy did not attend the presentation where the case study was delivered. Vera went, because she felt someone ought to, and she sat in the back row and listened to the agronomist describe what 35 years of Harold Lawson's philosophy, applied by Harold's son, had done to 180 acres of hill ground in a county where everyone had been certain the flat was the future. She drove home and told Roy what the agronomist had said, and Roy said that was good to hear, and they ate supper, and Roy went out to walk the fence line before dark, Scout following at his heel. The years after 2015 were not dramatic years in the way that 2012 had been dramatic. Roy farmed. Vera kept the ledger. The soil held what it had always held, and the cover crop stand came in each fall with the reliability of a thing that has been encouraged long enough to expect its own continuation. Glenn rebuilt his operation on the 360 acres he still held, trading some of his debt for a leaner operation, and by 2018 he was managing his ground in a way that was closer to Roy's method than Dale's, planting cereal rye on his bottomland fields after harvest and leaving more residue than he once had. He and Roy still talked. They still waved at each other on the road. The land had humbled Glenn without breaking him, and that was the best outcome the ground could have offered either of them. By 2023, Roy was 68 years old, and the farm looked almost exactly as it had in 1979, which was partly because Roy had not spent money making it look different, and partly because he had been making it better in a way that did not show on the surface. The farmhouse was the same house. The machine shed had a new roof. The ridges were darker in color and slower to crust after rain than they had been when he had inherited them, and the cover crop that was just beginning to show in October was dense enough that the soil between the rows was barely visible. The 1978 tractor had been replaced in 2004 with a 1991 model, bought used for $11,000 in cash, and it sat in the shed with the kind of easy readiness that a well-maintained piece of equipment develops over years of consistent care. Roy had been thinking about the Fowler place for 2 years. The Fowlers were the family that had owned the creek-bottom ground adjacent to Roy's south fence line, and in 2009 they had sold it under pressure from a note that had gone bad after the father, Paul Fowler, had borrowed against the land to fund a grain storage expansion that the commodity market of 2008 had made look like a sure thing, and the market of 2009 had made look like what it was. Paul had died in 2017 without having recovered any of the ground. His daughter, Danny Fowler, was 31 in 2023 and farming a leased acreage 10 miles away on ground that was not hers, paying cash rent to an absentee landowner who had not been on the farm since the Obama administration and who raised the rent every 3 years because he could. Roy had watched Danny farm for 2 years. He had watched how she handled the soil and how she asked questions at the extension meetings and how she planted her cover crops in September instead of October because she understood that establishment time mattered. He had talked to her exactly 4 times, all at the elevator or the co-op, and she was precise and practical. And she had her father's way of listening that meant she was thinking about what you said rather than waiting to respond. In September of 2023, Roy offered Danny the lease in the co-op parking lot. The two of them standing on the cracked asphalt with the smell of grain dust coming off the elevator downwind and a loaded semi idling at the scale. Roy had the terms in his head the way he kept all his numbers, without paper. 12 acres of his North Ridge, the ones with the 5.1% organic matter, at $60 per acre per year, with a first option purchase agreement at $1,800 per acre, payable on any schedule she chose with no interest. 12 acres at $1,800 per acre came to $21,600. It was not a gift because Roy did not believe in gifts that came without the discipline of payment and ownership. It was something closer to what his father had given him, which was a start on ground that had been earned by patience and was now being passed forward to someone who understood what patience was for. Danny said she needed a week to think about it. She came back in 4 days. "Yes," she said. "I want to do it right." "Your father would have done the same thing," Roy said. "The ground's ready." The first payment came in November of 2023. A check for $720, representing 1 year's rent, on 12 acres at $60 per acre. Vera was in the kitchen when Roy came in from the mailbox, and he handed her the envelope without opening it because she handled the ledger. She opened it at the counter and looked at the check and then wrote the amount in her spiral notebook, in the same column she had been keeping since 1979, and she handed Roy the check. The notebook lay open to a page near the back, the columns filled in her small, even hand all the way to the top line, 44 years of entries in the same ink, and she pressed the cap back onto her pen and set it beside the notebook with the unhurried certainty of someone who expects to pick it up again. Roy looked at the amount for a moment, then looked at his wife, and she had the expression of someone who has been keeping a book long enough to know that a new entry means something is continuing. Scout was on the porch. He was old now, 12 years old, and moving slowly, and he had taken to sleeping in a spot near the south end of the porch where the afternoon sun held longest into the evening. Roy went out and sat down in the chair beside him and put his hand on Scout's flank, and Scout's tail moved once against the porch boards in the slow, certain way of a dog who has been doing his job for a long time and knows it. The ridges ran out to the south in the late light, the cover crop thick and green on the north slope and just beginning to show on the south, and 12 of those acres were going to carry a young woman's name on a purchase agreement in Roy's kitchen drawer before spring. The soil under that cover crop had been building since 1979, putting away what every cover crop fall had given it, holding what others shed, making of patience something that neither rust nor variable interest rate nor a dry July could touch. Harold's notebook was still in the kitchen drawer, rubber band still holding its cover. The composition book had gone soft at the corners over 44 years, and the rubber band had been replaced twice. But the handwriting inside was still Harold's, and the first entry was still what it had always been, written in the block print of a man who had learned something worth recording. What the ground holds is what you put in it. Scout's tail moved once more and went still, and the ridges went gold in the last of the October sun.